Huples Cat. Sorry if that offends you, turn the channel off. I'm going to talk about reports recent that talking about depression and mental illness in COVID-19, and there's always a temptation amongst men and preppers to not think about depression and mental illness, but the truth is that this pandemic is causing an SHTF, which is causing a doubling in mental illness. I'm not talking about people being angry and upset and triggered easily. I'm talking about people who are actually sick, mentally sick. So it's really important to know what the signs and symptoms are and what the trigger factors are and who's really at risk, because this type of effect will be seen in any SHTF. So in the United Kingdom, in the period before the pandemic, approximately 1 in 10 adults, and this is a shocking statistic, had serious mental illness in terms of how they defined and how they answered questions on a questionnaire. So there is a little bit of a caveat there. It's not actually people that have been diagnosed by doctors or by nurses. However, that rate has gone to 1 in 5 since, which is incredibly high. So 1 in 8 people in Britain are showing signs of severe depressive illness, which is incredible. Now, interestingly, 1 in 25 adults in the United Kingdom have actually seen an improvement in their mental illness since the pandemic started, which is always an interesting factor. Yin and yang. So women aged 16 to 39 who are on disability and don't have any savings are the most likely to experience depression. No figure, it's a reactive. When I got married years and years ago in England, all the questions that the Reverend asked me and my future wife were actually financially based. And I said to him, why is our finance the only thing that you're interested in terms of our suitability to get married in your church? And it turned out that he said that everybody's marriages fail because of finance, which I thought was an interesting thing. So without financial pressure, he was saying that marriages just continue onwards and there's no divorce, which may have been true in the 80s. I don't know whether it's true now. So feeling stressed and anxious is almost 85% of the respondents. So the actual pandemic and resulting financial and social instability is causing a serious anxiety disorder and stress disorder in approximately 1 in 6 people in Britain. And I think that's also an important factor. Just because you're a prepper, just because you have a bug out group, just because you have family, doesn't mean that you or they will be immune to serious anxiety and stress disorders and depression in any future or current SHTF. Now, I said everybody. What they actually did was they looked at people and then went back to the same people. So they used the same actual sample of people to look at in terms of this. That could be giving you an accurate picture of the total of society, but it may not. There may be other factors at play. So bear that in mind. All research, if it's single research, is subject to problems, and you need to do multiple types of research aimed at the same answer using different components to make sure that what you're actually generalizing is truth. Because all quantitative scientific research like this is actually never proving anything. Only qualitative research can prove anything, and that can never be generalized. And indeed, the actual scientific research did in fact very clearly put that in. There may be a causal link between COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic and social effects and an increase in depression, or it may be unrelated. It may be related to, say for example, spending more time watching TV news might actually, no matter what the subject of TV news is, might actually cause depression. So I think that's what the authors are trying to warn you about here. Yes, it seems reasonable. Yes, it seems likely that what they're finding is a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom, but don't just assume that that's truth and then run with it. There could be other factors in play. And this not very helpful diagram actually shows the effect of the time period during the pandemic on the amount of serious depression that there has been in the United Kingdom. So though in this type of an SHTF event there's a lot of focus spent on the elderly because they're more likely to be locked in and having less social contacts, it turns out the actual age group most affected is 16 to 39 and female. Now that may be because women have hysteria and are more likely to get depressed, though I doubt that. It's probably more to do with the economic effects. Women tend to have short-term contract jobs more than men, generally speaking, and also generally speaking women end up having to do more childcare. And remember, schools have been closed and normal ways of getting rid of your kids out of your house have been ended for a period of time. Now they're talking about moderate to severe depressive symptoms, complete apathy, lack of ability to do anything, I was almost going to say lack of taste, but that's a different thing right now. Actually serious to moderate depression. They're not talking about generalized feelings that everything's going bad and it's terrible. They're talking about a level of depression that actually is directly and measurably affecting your ability to do some or all activities of daily living. That's one of the issues I think that we tend to forget about. But there is always that silver lining. A tiny handful of people are thriving emotionally and mentally due to probably the pandemic. Whatever their coping skills are that's actually making them feel happier and more in control during a pandemic, it would be very useful for preppers to be able to study those types of people, if in fact you don't think you are one, and actually figure out how you can make your family and friends and group and neighbours feel actually slightly happier during the event than before it. Now that's a huge, but I just wanted to point out that it isn't just that bad things happen and everybody's upset by them. A few people will always improve mentally during a crisis. Very few though. So one of the findings in the young population 16 to 39 was those that weren't working before really had basically stable rates of depression compared to those who were working before in that age group, who continued to work in the pandemic. So working in a pandemic actually is making people depressed. Not surprisingly, the clear messaging and all the rest of it is required, and people have to feel safe. People don't feel safe, they can start to dwell on things and they can get depressed. So I think that's a key factor. A lot of people out there have teenage and young adult children. It is useful to know that even if they're working, in fact especially if they're working as a key worker or not during the pandemic, they're actually significantly likely to be suffering from clinical depression. And you need to observe, monitor and get them help. All depression that's moderate to severe has to be clinically treated. The risk of suicide is very acute right now, and self-harm, and it's hidden because people don't assume those who are actually key workers and those who are actually not key workers who are working are suffering much. Women generally statistically experience depression more than men in a population, and that continues, and I think that's something to bear in mind. Again, it is significantly high in males, it's not non-existent in males. One of the really key indicators is poverty. If you don't have a substantial amount of cash savings to buy things in an unexpected manner, even if you have just about enough to keep going day to day, during the pandemic those people had higher rates of depression than people who had cash savings, everything else being equal. The other thing, of course, is fairly obvious, is the disabled. The disabled are suffering a lot more depression during the pandemic than they did before. And I think this is all key indicators here. It's really difficult when you think you're personally targeted by an invisible virus and other people around you are just ignoring it or trivializing it. It's very easy to get quite depressed. In normal times, living alone for most people is a risk factor for depression, and you'd expect that to be the same in a pandemic, especially with lock-ins and lockdowns and everything else, and quarantining and self-isolation. But what they found is quite an astounding fact. Yes, living alone is a risk factor for depression in the pandemic. It's equally as risky living with one or more other persons in a pandemic. In a pandemic, the effects of interpersonal relationships are strained to the point where being lonely and on your own is as equally a risk of depression as actually being with somebody you're not getting on with. No surprise for me, having a kid at home makes you more depressed than not having a child at home. I guess with all the school stuff that's going on in the United Kingdom and America, it's a really scary time. There's a little bit of that up in Canada, but I think generally speaking parents definitely have the option not to attend school, so there's no pressure from the government or the school board to force unwilling children and or unwilling parents to attend school in September. I think that's a key factor. To actually put in mandatory things can cause a huge amount of confusion and stress unless it's very clear what's being done and why it's being done, and it's made sure that everybody can actually equally respond to it and do it in a way that works for them as an individual, not just for everybody else. It's like staying at home. It's great unless you live in a tower block in an inner city area, and it isn't so great, is it? If you don't have a garden and you can't walk around the neighborhood, it's not so great not being able to go out. So remember, this is only talking about depression, but one of the really key things that this found is about to come up, and this will surprise a lot of preppers out there and homesteaders. England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland have the same proportionate increases in depression, and there is no statistical variation in disability or children or age group in the 4 countries. What was really stunning to me is that it doesn't matter whether you live in the city, whether you live in a town, whether you live in suburbia, or whether you live rural. The risk factors are identical, the rates of depression are identical. There is no way that you can claim living in the rural helps you compared to living in the city in a pandemic, based upon statistics, based upon depression. There are of course other things other than depression, but we're talking about depression here. So the people who develop depression in the pandemic in the United Kingdom, overwhelmingly it's anxiety and feeling seriously stressed. That's the main symptom. The other one that's very significant is loneliness. Close behind that is strain on personal relationships. Not surprisingly, if your relationship wasn't so good going into the pandemic, it's probably not doing so well now. And again, it's going to be very hard to get counselling, it's going to be very hard to split up and divorce if you're in lockdown, in quarantine. All of these factors aren't helpful. So one of the things I think that's really key for preppers going forward into the next pandemic, into the next SHTF, which probably won't be a pandemic, is that you need to fix your relationships. You need to fix your debt level. You need to fix your home arrangements in such a way that brings you joy in the now before the SHTF hits, because when the SHTF hits, any of those major issues are going to become massive and any minor issues are going to become big. Addressing the inner self, the spiritual, the mental, the happiness, the relational, is actually a really serious part of prepping. It's often overlooked. It's okay having lots of MREs and guns, but if you're deeply depressed and your relationships suck and you have no money and you have a lot of debt and you have insecurity in the SHTF, that's really going to cause serious depression. And serious depression is serious. One of the things they found, remember the United Kingdom has a relatively older population than other parts of the world, is that fear of being a burden, feeling being a burden on others was a much higher level, and that was definitely a trigger factor towards feeling depressed. So as I said, anxiety is the main symptom. Over 60% of the people with depressive symptoms, and remember that's about 10% of the population, have high anxiety levels. They're not going to listen to or be able to cope with instructions. They're not going to be acting rationally. It's going to be an interesting time if the society collapses, because SHTF has not seen to date a societal collapse. It's wobbling a bit in some places, but it hasn't collapsed. When it does collapse, depression will go through the roof. Most people will be clinically depressed, and of them, most of them will be so anxious and so stressed they won't be able to function reasonably in whatever comes after the SHTF begins. So loneliness is a definitive factor. People who feel lonely, remember, it doesn't matter whether they're living with somebody or not in a pandemic, are going to get depressed. Some of them are, and when they get depressed, they get worse. So one of the things you might want to consider if you are on your own, or if you're in a relationship and you're feeling lonely, is you might want to look at social contacts where you can talk and see people's face using internet. You might want to do a lot more walking around the neighbourhood than you might otherwise be able to do. You might want to force yourself to go out there and walk. And you might want to pick up litter and garbage. You might want to talk to people as you pass them by. When you go to the supermarkets, you shouldn't be going anyway when it's busy. When you go, make a point of being calm and breathing deeply and keeping social distance and keeping the mask on and washing your hands and looking people directly in the eye and thanking them and saying, "Oh, I hope you're okay." A lot of our grocery stores in Toronto, they've been programmed, I believe, to actually ask the customers, "Are you okay?" And it's really important that you talk back, that you give back from yourself, not just take. Because once you start taking and that gets reduced, you are at risk from depression. So that's it for me. I'm just going to throw up the summary slide. What do you lot think? Do you think that you are clinically depressed? 1 in 20 of us are anyway. Now it's probably more likely to be 1 in 10 of us are clinically depressed and needing treatment. And treatment's going to be very difficult to get. The snapping out of it and all the rest of it doesn't work. Clinical depression is a very dangerous thing. It's the one thing in SHTF you can't buy help from. And having a gun, having an MRE, having a bug-out bag, none of that is going to protect you from the insidious effects of depression in SHTF. And depression in SHTF can effectively reduce your survival chances to almost zero because it can easily cause suicide, it can easily cause inaction, and it can easily cause you to annoy other people. You don't want to be clinically depressed at normal times, and you certainly don't in an SHTF. And yet, we are human beings and at risk. Anyway, that's all from me. Have a great week. Doodles. This was a Cat in a Box production, 2020.